Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm actually posting this at night again, as you can see by the timestamp or recording it. I should say I'll post it in the morning, but I know everyone's favorite late night club is social studies with Mr. Mosca in his sun porch. So you're welcome for that. Today we're going to review the quiz that I gave you on Wednesday, that covered lessons 3 through 5. We'll quickly review lesson 6, where we talked about inflation and hyperinflation in the South. And then we'll get into lesson 7, that talks about a place called Andersonville, which really came as a result of some decision making by the Southern leaders and also as a result of some of the inflation that they suffered. But before we get into that, just want to give a quick happy birthday to my Grammy Cormier, who is 92 years old today. So, my mom is up in northern Maine visiting her, so maybe they'll um, click on the little YouTube link and she'll watch her grandson talk about social studies, or maybe just listen to a happy birthday. So happy birthday, Grammy! I hope you have a good day up there with mom. All right, so on to the lesson here. I'm sorry, the quiz. Number 1, who was the Union general in charge of the Battle of Shiloh? That would be C. Ulysses S. Grant. So this is long before he became president of the United States, of course. Jumping over number 5, the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves who were in the Confederate States. It did not free all the slaves in the United States. That's what the 13th Amendment did. But in order to make the war not just about keeping the Union together, but also as a tool of liberation. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued that freed the slaves in the Confederate States. Number 2, Scott's Great Snake was also called the Anaconda Plan, B. Jumping over to 6, Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln, of course, the president, in 1863. Scott's Great Snake was a type of blockade. A lot of people put marching formation, and I understand why it's a formation, but a marching formation is much smaller scale. The blockade, making it so goods could not come into the South, or more importantly, leave the South, right? So they're not going to be able to take their valuable cotton and sell it to foreign markets and get whatever they needed in return. Number 7, that would be the Mrs. Bixby letter. A lot of people said, or not a lot, but some people said Mrs. Sullivan. Sullivan Ballou was the gentleman who wrote to his wife Sarah, but Mrs. Bixby was the one who received the letter from Abraham Lincoln. Number 4, which side eventually had African American soldiers fight on their side? That would be the Union. I was a little surprised at how many people said the Confederacy. Knowing what you do about views on slavery, does it really make sense that the Confederacy would give tens of thousands of black soldiers uniforms and guns? And would the black soldiers be willing to fight for that side in order to keep slavery going? That doesn't make any sense. And number 8, B.Y. Malone's journal. He was a prisoner of war at the time that he wrote that from, was it Point Lookout, I think, in Maryland. All right. So jumping over to lesson 6. Again, this is just a review. I know it was a long video that most of you watched, but just the idea that inflation is something that happens all the time in the economy, right? The cost of things 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago are not what they are now. And a lot of that has to do with inflation, and why you might think, oh, that stinks, things cost more. Wouldn't it be, wow, wouldn't it be cool if, wouldn't it be cool if it cost 25 cents to go to the movie theater? Wouldn't it be cool if a Coca-Cola is only 10 cents, something like that? Well, that's true, but also keep in mind that wages would be low. So whether, jobs at grocery stores that some of you might have, or Dunkin' Donuts, or your allowances or whatever, those are all going to be less by a much, much greater degree. So inflation happens, but with the South, we talked about what happened with hyperinflation. So you see that red line there, that as it goes up, well, what does this all mean? It means that prices go up a lot. So for instance, if we were to live in 2020 and you have a $3 bag of chips, Well, can you imagine 4 years from now, that same bag of chips costing almost $300? That's the level of inflation that some parts of the South experienced during the Civil War, which gets the idea of if you need this to stop, right? This is not a sustainable way. This is a failure of the state. This is a failure of the economy that you have. And if you want this to stop, well, you could either win the war, which is kind of difficult, or you could sort of maybe not support the war anymore. So um, that might be a reason to think that even without slavery in Southern life, perhaps it would be better than what they are dealing with that terrible inflation. And then finally, how does this affect real people? Well, many of the women in Richmond, Virginia, their husbands, their brothers, their sons are off fighting the war, and they're left behind with low supplies, skyrocketing prices as they slowly starve to death in the Confederate capital. Another impact of that is something called Andersonville. So let me just, there I am. Andersonville is known as being the worst prison camp, POW camp of the American Civil War. And let's talk about how that came about uh, right now. So this is new lesson 7 for the day. Um, in the Civil War, they used to have a pretty healthy system of prisoner exchange. So if somebody was a Union soldier and you were taken prisoner during a battle, you would be brought to a prisoner of war camp for weeks, months, usually not years, because before it turned into years, you would typically be exchanged. And both sides worked out sort of what the ratios would be like, if a major was captured, how many privates would equal a major, would equal a lieutenant, would equal a sergeant, things like that. But this now, you might say to yourself, well, yes, but when the people are released back to their home side, won't they just turn around and start fighting again? That's true. But do you really want to spend your time, your resources, your money feeding and clothing people from the other side when you could better use that money, use that resource, feeding and clothing and arming soldiers from your own side? So anyway, the system of prisoner exchange was very common during the early part of the war. Um, but that all changed into as black soldiers began fighting for the North. So this is highlighted in something called the Fort Pillow Massacre. Fort Pillow, I know it has sort of a silly name, like something that my kids would build in the morning. It's actually named after a guy named Gideon Pillow, and it's a fort along the Mississippi River in Tennessee. Not typically not very large, but it was held by 600 Union soldiers, and of those 600 Union soldiers, 300 of them were African American. It was overrun by a guy named Nathan Bedford Forrest and his Confederate soldiers. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest, that's actually, if some of you have seen the movie Forrest Gump, Forrest Gump is named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. In the movie, and Nathan Bedford Forrest is also perhaps even better known for being one of the founders of the KKK. Not exactly a feather in his cap, but anyway, Nathan, a very successful cavalryman during the Civil War, though. So anyway, as the soldiers at Fort Pillow, both white and black, are attempting to surrender, they're essentially massacred instead. They are killed. And this started, became customary that when black soldiers in the Union attempted to surrender, as would happen in battles, that instead of being taken as prisoners, they would be killed. Ulysses S. Grant was incredibly upset by this, and basically stopped the system of prisoner exchange as long as this continued to happen. All that had to happen was for Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis or somebody in the Southern Command to say that we are going to treat surrendering soldiers, no matter their race or ethnicity, the same. But the South declined to do that. They thought that by basically instilling the fear in black soldiers that they would no longer fight because they knew that they would not be kept as a prisoner. Instead, they would be killed. So therefore, that dragged the system of prisoner exchange to a halt. Well, what does that mean? We already know that women and children in the Confederate capital don't necessarily have enough to eat. So, what do you think is going to happen to the Union soldiers who are taken as prisoner? They're not going to have much. So, we have a couple primary sources. And the one from Elmira, New York. Now, this actually highlights not how conditions were in the Confederacy, but how they were in the Union. So this describes the rations, right, the food that Confederate prisoners of war would be given in Elmira, New York. It talks about not just their food, but also the temperatures and the clothing that they had. And it's pretty bad, when you start to read about like 3 or 4 ounces of food. Well, think about 4 ounces, right? That's a quarter pounder, and that's just the patty of it, and that be like basically all you're given in the day, and also 2 meals. So that's the Elmira, New York section. And the next one talks about this place called Andersonville, which becomes is known as sort of the most notorious of all the prison camps. It was incredibly large. It was not built to be that large, but because of the system of prisoner exchange, because that stopped, Andersonville ended up with thousands and tens of thousands of soldiers when it was only built for a fraction of that. There is a video linking to the Ken Burns documentary. You don't necessarily have to watch it. I don't think that you can understand based upon the reading that Andersonville was terrible and what happened there. But it is sort of shocking. So I'll give you a little warning there that some of the images are upsetting. You won't see necessarily dead people, but you will see people who are alive who survived Andersonville and starvation that took place there. And it's pretty haunting, some of the images that you see. I believe Walt Whitman said, the dead there are not to be pitied as much as the living, meaning that, maybe sometimes people were lucky not to survive that, based upon the painful recovery that would take place when you have men who are 160, 170 pounds, but when they leave Andersonville, they're 75 pounds, 80 pounds, 90 pounds, something like that. It's pretty shocking. So anyway, it's a quick video. It's from the same movie that we've been watching. And that's there. Last thing I'll say about that is the gentleman here that you see, his name is Henry Wurz. I believe he was a captain or a major. I think he was a captain. He was actually from the North, but he ended up moving down to Louisiana with his family. Earlier in battle, he had lost a musket ball had hit him in the right arm. He didn't have use of it, so he sort of turned to clerical work, which was running prisons. And he was the one in charge of Andersonville. A lot of blame was placed on Henry Wirz. How do we know that? Well, if you can see this image right here, those are the gallows that were set up for his execution. He's only one of a few people who were executed for war crimes because of what happened during the Civil War. So, like Jefferson Davis, the president, Robert E. Lee, these people were not executed after the war, but Henry Wirz was, because of the atrocities and the images that you see from Andersonville. Now, sympathetically, you could say, what better could he do, right? He wasn't the one who stopped the system of prisoner exchange. He couldn't, create food and resources out of thin air to feed these prisoners of war. However, it was an atrocity. It was awful, and someone had to pay, and ended up being Henry Wirz. And so there you see the some of the markers that are there for the people who passed away, and then you can also see this picture of what Andersonville would have looked like. And finally, the end, just a couple questions to make sure you understand. All right, so that is Tuesday's lesson. Those 3 questions are due for Wednesday morning, and I will be in touch with you guys later on. Just a little bit of heads up. Next Thursday, of course, is our final day of remote learning. So I think I'll probably give you the test next Wednesday, and you'll have Wednesday and Thursday, and then a few more days in which to finish the unit test. But that will be it. All right, I will. Like I said, I'll be in touch with you guys later. And once again, happy birthday, Grammy Cormier. 92 years, pretty impressive. Love you.